Hello, welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Ji Ha-ham. The first standalone trilateral summit of the leaders of the United States, South Korea, and Japan was held at Camp David. The summit was the culmination of their efforts to respond effectively to the rapidly changing security and economic order in the region. We'll discuss North Korean, Chinese, and Russian variables that could hamper close US-ROK-Japan coordination, as well as the steps that strengthen ties between South Korea and Japan, which have been crucial in the journey to the trilateral summit.
That's because our countries are stronger and the world is safer. Let me say that again. Our countries are stronger and the world will be safer as we stand together.
各种排他性小圈子、小集团，将阵营对抗和军事集团带入亚太的企图，不得人心，势必招致地区国家的警惕和反对。
일본이 유엔 사령부에 제공하는 7곳 후방기지의 역할은 북한의 남침을 차단하는 최대 억제 요인입니다.
In the studio with me is Jeffrey Hornung. Dr. Hornung is a senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation. He's also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. Dr. Hornung specializes in Japanese security and foreign policies, East Asian security issues, and U.S. foreign and defense policies in the Indo-Pacific region. Scott Snyder is also with us today. Mr. Snyder is a director of U.S.-Korea policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. Mr. Snyder's new edited volume reviews the first decade of North Korean foreign policy under Kim Jong-un. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Hornung, the U.S., South Korea, and Japan have stressed the importance of the trilateral cooperation. But we understand their priorities may be different. How do you see the differences in priorities of the three countries in this summit?
Well, I think if you look at the similarities, they do have a similarity with concerns about North Korea as well as a broad, stable Indo-Pacific region. I think the one area where there is a difference in priorities comes down to China. If you look at strategic documents and statements by the United States and Japan, they tend to use similar language, whether that be strategic challenge or pacing threat, long-term pacing threat. We don't tend to see similar language coming out of public statements or strategic documents from South Korea, and so I think that's possibly the one area where there's a difference in priorities.
Mr. Snyder, the United States and Japan both seem to perceive China as a concern or a threat, as just Dr. Hornung just mentioned. I mean, in the case of South Korea, do you think the position is really more complicated?
Historically, I think that has been the case, and I think what is interesting about this summit and some of the statements that have come from leaders, for instance, the trilateral statement from Phnom Penh, is that it shows that the gap has shrunk and that there's a greater convergence among the U.S., Japan, and South Korea. Historically, on the South Korean side, I think that because South Korea is geographically so close to China, it means that there's a greater risk exposure that South Korea has to manage. And also historically in South Korean and Korean interactions with China, it's been a different kind of approach where Korea has tended to be accommodating to China's aims because of the relative size differential and because of the location where South Korea is in relationship to China.
Right. Dr. Hornung, however, it is no exaggeration to say that there is almost no country in the world that does not have a deep economic relationship with China. So South Korea is not the only one who can appeal for understanding about the special relationship with China. While the United States, Japan, and Australia are all countering China, how come South Korea is the only one who wants to be recognized its uniqueness or exception? Do you think this is fair?
I think in some ways when you say is it fair, I don't think it's fair necessarily to just point out South Korea in that matter, because if you look at other countries in Southeast Asia, if you look at the islands at the Oceania, they're also looking to try to maintain positive relations with China while at the same time trying to maintain positive relations with the United States. They're trying to balance and have positive relations with both. I think Japan and in the context of the three countries, Japan really has only come about to this really hard stance against China over the last decade, maybe 15 years. And it's really come about just because of growing very tired and of increasing Chinese provocations, increasing statements that go against Japanese interests, and just sort of a growing influence of China in the region that has really started to grow on Japanese national interests, and so it's started to push back. So it's a recent phenomenon over the last decade to 15 years.
Mr. Snyder, do you think South Korea should be involved more on solidarity against China?
I think that based on what President Yoon has presented in terms of common values and in terms of his emphasis on universal freedom, it's understandable why South Korea has come into that convergence. But I also think there's something else that is important about this alignment of South Korea with the U.S. and Japan related to the Yoon administration's objectives, and that is that it is not just an end in and of itself. It's also a means to the end of enhancing South Korea's global status as a global pivotal state. Really, I think that objective cannot be achieved without close alignment with the U.S. and Japan.
Mr. Snyder, South Korea's opposition party argued that the overemphasis on the U.S.-South Korea-Japan cooperation could have a negative impact on South Korea's future China policy, or that China could take retaliatory measures on South Korea. However, the reality is a bit different, that China is lifting bans on group tour. Also, China shows interest in engaging with South Korea, even though that issue remains the same. When the previous so-called China-friendly government, Moon government, was in power, China did not lift any sanctions on South Korea. So doesn't this show how South Korea should deal with China?
Well, you're pointing to a domestic debate that does represent the fact that there's not necessarily a full consensus around China policy. However, South Korean public opinion has shifted, I think, largely in the direction of being anxious and concerned about China. The really significant aspect of the debate from my perspective is related to the question of can South Korea effectively deal with China on its own, or is it better for South Korea to deal with China in the context of or standing on the platform that is provided by the alliance with the United States? And I think that it's pretty clear that South Korea is more able to achieve some of its objectives as related to policy toward China if it's working in concert with the United States rather than standing on its own.
Right. So China is now seeking to strengthen relations with South Korea and Japan, the countries that are strengthening cooperation with each other and the United States through a series of summits. What do you think? Is this a sign of maybe China's nervousness?
So if you look at China in the past, China has always sought to try to keep the U.S. and its allies divided, whether driving wedges in between them or trying to raise different issues. Having all three countries work together and come closer in different areas really works against Chinese interests. It's not surprising to see statements coming out of Beijing talking and criticizing this as sort of a NATO-type gathering. But it's obvious that China perhaps feels a little anxious itself, seeing that you have this greater grouping or this greater commonality among them. And I wouldn't be surprised that their outreach now to try to get some more meetings with their counterparts in South Korea and Japan is driven by some of that anxiety.
Mr. Snyder, North Korea, China, and Russia are strengthening their solidarity to counter the U.S., South Korea, Japan cooperation. What do you think of the strength of their alliance compared to the U.S. ROK Japan partnership, which is based on the values of freedom and democracy? In fact, without the external factors of the U.S., South Korea, Japan cooperation, maybe North Korea, China, and Russia do not have much motivation to maintain a friendly relationship with each other. Do you agree? I mean, do you think they really pose a significant threat to the United States and South Korea and Japan?
Well, I think that trilateral cooperation among North Korea, China, and Russia is relatively nascent. And it looks to me like it is in part a response to what is happening on the U.S., Japan, South Korea side. But yes, I think there are more fissures in terms of the foundation for cooperation among the three. For one, we know that North Korea engages with Russia in part to counterbalance its excessive dependency on China. So that's one factor. But I think that it's pretty clear that this three-way cooperation among the North Korea, China, and Russia, I mean, Kim Jong-un signaled it very clearly at the end of last month by inviting a Chinese leader and the Russian defense minister to their major parade commemorating the armistice. So I think that is a clear indication that trilateral cooperation is part of the response, despite the fact that each of these three, China, Russia, and North Korea, actually their default response is unilateral. It's actually not collective. And so that may actually be the biggest cultural issue that inhibits the ability of the three to work together.
Dr. Hornung, the CSIS report released in January predicted the course of battle in the event of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan through a war game. China suffers heavy losses and fails to occupy Taiwan. But at the same time, the United States also suffers tremendous losses without South Korea's involvement. So when the United States repeatedly emphasizes cooperation between the United States, Japan, South Korea for regional security, isn't this the U.S. pressure on South Korea to participate in conflicts in the Indo-Pacific?
So the CSIS war game and other war games that are held in Washington, it was just that, it was a war game. I tend to look at the growing trilateral security cooperation mattering in peacetime all the way up through a contingency. And so having greater trilateral cooperation in peacetime among Japan, the United States, South Korea will matter for signaling, will matter for deterrent efforts, as well as across domains, whether that be military, whether that be economic, diplomatic, development. So there's a whole range of things that this trilateral grouping can do in peacetime that matters. When we get into a contingency, whether that be over Taiwan or elsewhere, that's not related to the Korean Peninsula, there are a range of things that the United States may want, whether that be flowing logistical assets through Korea, through Japan, whether that be actually utilizing U.S. assets from the peninsula or from Japan, as well as asking the Korean military and the Japanese defense forces to participate. So there's a whole range of things. So I think when you look at the success of the trilateral cooperation right now, I wouldn't look at it just in terms of would South Korea participate in a Taiwan conflict. I think there's a whole range of things from peacetime to contingency that greater trilateral cooperation could actually help foster to deter efforts, not just North Korea related, but China related as well.
Dr. Hornung, in the summit, the new security ties between the three countries were emphasized. However, in times of crisis in Japan, do you expect South Korea can really engage? And vice versa. I mean, when South Korea is in a similar situation, can Japan really take their part unless they have a territorial ambition?
So this is a really tricky question. I think if you're looking at, first, if Japan is in a contingency, that would involve something with Taiwan or the Southwest Islands in Japan. I think there's an ability here for South Korea to provide intelligence information about North Korean activity, Chinese activity in the north, something like that. But kinetic activity, I don't necessarily see a role for South Korea to play if Japan's Southwest Islands are under attack. On the flip side, if there was a Korean contingency and the armistice was broken and U.S. forces are engaged, I think here there's a similar role for U.S. or for Japanese ISR assets to provide intelligence, but the critical role that Japan will play is having the UNC, the United Nations rear headquarters in Japan and having a status of forces agreement with the United Nations so that sending states can provide forces through Japan. That will be a critical role that Japan can play for a contingency on the Korean Peninsula.
Okay, Mr. Snyder, in the run-up to the summit, the Yoon Suk-yeol government has taken a markedly different approach to Japan than its predecessor. President Yoon has repeatedly emphasized Japan as a cooperative partner, not as an object of condemnation and demand for repentance. What do you think the impact will be of this stance on South Korea, regional security, and even U.S. ROK Japan cooperation?
Well, it's been a prerequisite for this trilateral summit to even occur. I don't think that it would have occurred if it hadn't been for President Yoon's commitment to normalizing the relationship with Japan. And then subsequently, he's gotten the benefit of a very positive state visit to Washington, as well as the invitation to the G7 at Hiroshima. And likewise, as I mentioned earlier, for President Yoon's foreign policy, if he wants to move further in terms of global status, I think an implicit prerequisite is a solid relationship with the U.S. and Japan. But he still, I think, does face a domestic political obstacle, and that is that the consolidation of the Japan-South Korea relationship from the South Korean public perspective, I think still does remain incomplete. And we'll have to see whether the progress that has been signaled in trilateral coordination and the institutionalization of that coordination can help to overcome some of those concerns. I think that in the end, President Yoon is not going to be successful if he decides just to sweep history under the rug, but rather, as he indicated in his earlier framing of the relationship, deal with the future in order to be able to deal with the past. I think that's the correct formulation if you're going to win support and consensus from the South Korean public.
Okay. Dr. Hornung, so President Yoon, for the first time, as you mentioned, the strategic importance of Japan in the event of contingency in the Korean Peninsula. He said the role of the 7 rear bases provided by Japan to the United Nations Command is the greatest deterrent factor in blocking North Korea's invasion of the South. What do you read from this unprecedented approach?
So when you look at Liberation Day speeches from the standpoint of Japan, Japanese officials usually brace themselves for some sort of criticism or regarding Japan's occupation of Korea. And it usually causes some sort of setback in relations. That was not the case this time. And there was a real tremendous, not just a sigh of relief, but a real surprise that President Yoon said something like that. There is a recognition in Japan that President Yoon's, as Scott was mentioning, this wouldn't have happened without President Yoon's commitment. And there's a recognition that he has shown massive political courage to do what he's doing. That said, there is also a degree of caution or concern that this could get walked back by the next, if a progressive administration follows President Yoon. Officials in Japan are very quick to note the 2015 Comfort Women Agreement that was final and irreversible and how that was walked back a few years after that. And so I think there is a cautious optimism in Tokyo right now, especially given speeches like President Yoon gave on Liberation Day.
Mr. Snyder, however, the Korean opposition party strongly criticizes President Yoon's relatively active cooperation with Japan and still raising the historical issues. How do you evaluate the perspective that criticizes President Yoon's different approach as pro-Japanese?
Well, I think it is politically sensitive in South Korea to cast anybody as pro another country. And so I think that is a little bit dangerous political rhetoric. I believe that progressive Koreans and conservative Koreans primarily focused on the Korean national interest as their kind of touchstone for how they move forward. Now, having said that, there is, I think, still a basis for the progressive camp to wonder whether or not the aims of their desired policy toward Japan as related to addressing historical grievances is going to be met under the Yoon administration. And I think that's precisely the reason why the way this has played out, it has become a source of potential domestic political polarization rather than an opportunity to compartmentalize the issue of Japan from domestic politics in South Korea. And so what has happened has happened. I think that there still is a potential opportunity to compartmentalize the relationship with Japan from domestic politics, but it's going to require some hard work and heavy lifting, actually from a number of parties involved with the process.
Some point out that Korea has suffered much more historical damage from China than Japan. You both have observed the issue for many years. How come South Korea only sharply criticized Japan while being quiet to China's aggression, historical distortion, and territorial to those claims?
Well, what I would actually focus on as related to Korean responses to Japan versus China is that Koreans know that there is a limit to the potential for retaliation for criticism of Japan that is implicit in the existence of the U.S.-Japan alliance and the fact that U.S., Japan, and South Korea are tethered together to some degree. Whereas with regard to China, there really is no structural limit in terms of how China might retaliate. And so I think that the natural inclination of South Korea in dealing with China is to engage in self-censorship. Now, occasionally we see that self-censorship broken. It comes out usually in the expression of the number of times that China has invaded the Korean peninsula. And when it does come out, those numbers are very high. And I think that it does reflect that Korea retains a sensitivity to the fact that it has been the doormat for international geopolitics in the region historically for a long time.
Yeah. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Snyder, Dr. Hornung.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, that does it for today's Washington Talk. Please join us again next week for more analysis.